And we are live. Hello, people. How you doing? I'm just going to continue this book, Irish Druids and Old Irish Religion. This is part 7. It's actually been longer than I thought. There's been loads of wee chapters, but some of the chapters are drawn out as well. Like, for example, the serpents worship. There was like 6 chapters there, and the evil eye was like a paragraph. So it's sort of broken up into sort of big chunks and wee chunks. So I can't really gauge how long it's going to take me to finish this, but hopefully this will be finished soon. Anyway, guys, I hope you are doing good. I try to give a heads up on my website that I was going to do a reading at this time. I put a wee link in the forum on my website at jedskepticmedia.com. So, guys, get over there and start posting and give me some new ideas for places to explore and things to research. And that's why I got this up and running. You know what I mean? Anyway, back to the book, people. And where were we? Where did we leave off? Right, so it was the sun customs was the last thing we were reading. So fire worship is the newest. And this should be pretty long. See these adverts that pop up in these websites? You can't actually get rid of them. They just keep popping up. Look, it's like whack-a-mole. Right, anyway. James Bonwick, 1894. And that's another thing, people. Like, I'm going to go back and research a lot of the stuff I'm reading, like some of the places and some of the monuments and the druidic houses and stuff like that. And I'm going to go back and research to see even if these places exist anymore, because this book was written in 1894, and that was like 150 years ago or something. So, again, it's 100, well, just under 150 years, but it's a wee while. You know what I mean? Anyway. From the earliest time, the sun has been the object of human adoration, but the common flame itself, being destructive yet beneficial, while ever mounting upward as if disdaining earth contact, became the most races of mankind a religious emblem, if not a deity. Pyrolatria, or fire worship, was once nearly universal. The Moloch of the Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians was the divinity of various nations under different names. Moloch was not only deity tormenting simple maids and tender babes with fire. The blazing or fiery cross in use among Khans of India was well known in both Ireland and Scotland. The Egyptians, with more modern Africans, have reverenced flame. The Irish assuredly were not behind the most cultured peoples in this respect. The sanctity of their places for fire was notorious. The ancient lighting of fires was attended with solemn ceremonies. Even now, the trampling upon cinders in a household is regarded in some way as an indignity to the head of the establishment. According to the old records of the Four Masters of Ireland, a curious spectacle was witnessed one St. George's Day. Having reference to this curious superstition, at Rosdella, now Rosdala of Westmeath, a tower of fire blazed upon from a belfry for hours, while a great blackbird, accompanied by a flock of smaller birds, kept flying in and out of the fire, the smaller taking shelter under the wings of the leader. When the great bird had finished its fiery purifications, it took up an oak tree by the roots and flew off with it. Persia was once the high seat of fire worship. The Parsis of India were refugees from Persia at the time of the Mahometan conquest of that country, and they still retain the old fire religion. The natural flames that issued from the earth were regarded as divine, have pointed out to the practical moderns the mineral oil deposits of Baku. At the Sees or fire feast of Persia, says Richardson, birds and beasts were let loose with inflammable material about them. American Indians, in some cases, retained this custom of their ancestors. Squire notes the supreme, holy spirit of fire, Luk Ishta Hula Abba, and the ignition of new fires at the solar festival. The priests got fire by friction. The Pawnees had a sacrifice of human beings in fire at the vernal equinox. The Aztecs had a god of fire in Zuhuitlicue. The image of Hercules, the sun god, was solemnly burnt once a year at Tarsus. The scriptures have many references to this worship. A story is told in Maccabees of a priest who took sacred fire from the altar and hid it in a cave. Upon Nehemiah ascending for it, water only was found, yet when the liquid was poured over an altar of wood, the whole burst into flame. Fenny remarks, the British spire now fills the place in the plains of the once inspiring flame which ascended from the hill altars. And this is what I realised when I visit a lot of these hilltop forts. These forts, there was places where they burnt fires on top of the forts, and they say it was to obviously warn when there was enemies approaching. So one hilltop could light the fire, and the next hilltop lights a fire, and it's like a chain, and it's like a long distance communication. So you do find evidences, right? The perpetual lamps of the ancients sanctioned the same idea. No less than 170 Roman, Arab, and medieval writers record the finding of such lamps. In 1540, a lamp was reportedly still burning in the tomb of Cicero's daughter. Lights were buried in urns. Herodotus speaks of lamps in the tombs of Egypt. Augustine wrote of lights inextinguishable by either rain or wind. Asbestos wicks of lamps were known in Greek temples. I think there was a stuff called Greek fire that the Greeks used in warfare, and it was like a sticky material, like oil, like it was like a petrol bomb in a sense. And this could be related to that liquid, because it's hard to imagine something not being like, you can imagine like a flammable liquid, oil or something like that, and not being able to put out like raining on it, and it's still burning. And that's there's fuel in there somewhere when you think about that. So it just leads me to think about the Greek fire. Madame Blavatsky says that Buddhist priests, this is about the fourth time she's been mentioned in this, by the way, that priests made use of asbestos wicks. Dr. Westcott, who records instances of perpetual lamps, adds, there formerly existed an art that has been lost. And maybe this is where the Olympic flame comes from as well. This idea of the Olympic flame. Ireland was not without her perpetual fire. St. Bridget and her nuns, in maintaining a constant flame in Kildare, were but continuing a very ancient heathen custom. Tradition says that Druids did the same also in sacred Kildare, as there was an Irish goddess, Bridget. Higgins remarked that the deity had become a saint when the disciple of St. Patrick founded her nunnery at Kildare. The Welsh ecclesiastic who wrote of the Norman conquest of Ireland says of this fire that though ever recruited with fuel, yet the ashes have never increased. It was fed with the wood of the hawthorn. The place of the fire is described as being 20 feet square with a stone roof. The virgin daughters of the fire were Ingian, Au Daga, but as firekeepers were Brookwood. The Brudens, a place of magical cauldron and perpetual fires, disappeared with Christianity. Those flames were devoted by the Celts, etc., to Hestia, who stood in the place of Vesta, being in the Brudens now means in the fairies. The Greek Pertenium was like the Brudens, a public feeding house where the fire never went out. The baptism of fire was an Indian institution. The Mexicans, Virginian Indians, and Peruvians had their perpetual fire of a religious character. A curious sect arose once in Spain that burnt a cross on the forehead of the child in baptism. Lucius Florus said of Numa Pompilius, he appointed a fire to be kept up by the Vestal Virgins, the flame, in imitation of the stars, might perpetually watch as the guardians of the empire. The Archbishop of Dublin in 1220, shocked at this revival of fire worship under the mask of Christianity, ordered that Kildare fire to be extinguished. It was, however, relighted and duly maintained until the suppression of the nunnery in the reign of Henry VIII, as an old poet sang. The bright lamp that shone in Kildare's holy fane and burned through long ages of darkness and stain. The Parasi of India have such fire that burned for 1200 years. This is Udwada near Balsar, which is much frequented by Parsi pilgrims during certain periods of the year. The writer once questioned a Parsi in Bombay on this matter. The gentleman repudiated the idea of fire or sun worship, declaring that he saw the deity better by that symbol than by any other. As the Egyptian priests were said to acknowledge the same, it is possible that the Irish priests recognized in sun and flame but symbols of the invisible God. Mrs. Bryant, however, asserts that there is more trace of sun and fire worship in the peasantry lingering among us today than in the bardic literature of the remote Irish past. Dr. Waddell in Ossian and the Clyde had no doubt of fire worship being extant in Ossian's days. Dr. O'Brien thinks that the Gadalians or Gaels, everywhere they went, established fire worship. The Gaba Bail was an ordeal by fire. Two sects were said to be in the island, the Baalites, or fire adorers, and the Lyrites, or devotees of water. O'Kearney tells us, it is probable that the very violent contentions were once carried on in Ireland by the partisans of the rival religions, who were accustomed to meet and decide their quarrels at the place set apart for battle. The Samshinks were devoted to fire worship, and the Swans to lyre worship. And it reminds me of these two opposing gods you hear in Celtic religion. And it's like Baal worship. We've got the Beltane, and we've got all this, like what we were studying earlier with Samhain and the sea worship and the reverence of the water and the sea by the Celts. And they're kind of opposing elements in a way, fire and water. And you can see there's war between them. Metaphorically as well. Right, swans to lyre worship. Right, May Day in Ireland was very strictly observed, as it has been in Babylon ages before. Even now, says Mrs. Bryant, in remote places, if the fire goes out in a peasant's house before the morning of the 1st of May, a lighted sod from the priest's house to kindle it is highly esteemed. On that day, they once burnt hares from a fancy that they stole the butter. The eve of May Day was a trying time, as fairies were then extra frolicsome in stealing the milk. For preventive, the cows were driven through fires, as in distant pagan days. According to Hone, 1825, in Dublin, folks would cast horses' heads into the bonfire. Horses were sun animals. May Eve rejoicings were known by the name of Nek na Beltane. According to the books of rites, Ultonian kings were not to bathe on May Day. O'Connor remarks that the May fire ceremonies were transferred by St. Patrick to the 24th of June, John Baptist Day. Leaping through fire symbolized human sacrifice. Beltane or Baltine was a Roman compitalia or glad times for the beginning of the year. The Tailtean games of the Irish were said to have originated from Teilt, wife of Mac-Erc, the last Firbolg king, killed in the Battle of Moytour. May Eve was, with some, Nin na Beltina, Baal's fire Eve. Keating, right on the fair at Usnik of Meath, says, this fair or assembly was held on the first day of the month of May, and there were wont to exchange or barter their cattle and other property there. They were also accustomed to make offerings to the chief god which they worshipped, named Bel, and it was custom with them to make 2 fires in honour of this Bel in every cantred of Ireland, and to drive a couple of every kind of cattle in the cantred between the 2 fires as a preservative. So this ceremony, this Beltane ceremony, there was 2 fires lit, and the cattle were driven between the fire to kill ticks and diseases, and it actually helped. It was supposedly like a purifier. Easter time was duly celebrated in pagan as it is now in Christian times. The joyful season of awakening summer was being celebrated on Tara Hill at the very moment when St. Patrick was lighting his Easter fire on Slane Hill, within sight of the king and his court. The books of rites informs us that Patrick goes afterwards to Ferta Fear Fek. A fire is kindled by him at that place on Easter Eve. Laguerre is enraged as he sees the fire, for that was the geise of Team Hare among the Gaedil. The king had, according to custom, ordered all fires out, as no fresh blaze could be kindled but directly or indirectly from his own fire. This incident in the life of the saint is the most interesting of his career, but can only be briefly referred to here. It was when standing on the site of the royal palace at Tara Hill and looking across the beautiful country to the distant hill of Slane that we seem to realise the legend. Druids had forewarned the king of the coming of strangers, but were much astonished as he was at the sight of a blaze afar, when no light could be raised out but by the sovereign's command. Orders were issued for the rest of the bold intruders. St. Patrick and his shaven companions were brought into the presence of the masters of fire. Then he told his tale and lighted a flame in Erin never to be quenched. The story, as given us by a bent old woman of 70 years, will not be soon forgotten. Leaning on her stick with one hand and pointing over the almost deserted region to the hill of the saint's fire with the other, heaving a sigh over the departed glories of Tara, she might have been taken for a druidess herself. That paschal fire was a victor over pagan fires with their abominable Moloch associations. Midsummer fires served as sun charms to keep up the heat. Midsummer Eve, however, afterwards nominated as John the Baptist's Eve, was a great fire day far and wide. Von Buck, the traveller, speaks of seeing the custom observed within the Arctic Circle. An old writer about Ireland remarked, "A stranger would imagine the whole country was on fire. Brand writes of the vigil of St. John. They make bonfires and run along the streets and fields with wisps of straw blazing on long poles to purify the air which they think's infectious by believing all the devils, spirits, ghosts, and hobgoblins fly abroad this night to hurt mankind." One writing in 1867 said, "The old pagan fire worship still survives in Ireland, though nominally in honour of St. John. On Sunday night, bonfires were observed throughout nearly every county in the province of Leinster. As Easter Day was of old devoted to Astarte, the Eastern goddess, so was St. John's Day to Baal. But the eve of the 1st of November was the Hallow Eve or Samhain, when the fires were a thanksgiving to the sun at the end of the harvest. Keating, who notes the sacred fire lighted by the Archdruid on Uznag Hill, Kildare, tells of the fires on the Hill of Ward, Meath County, on the last day of October. Some old writers identify this period, rather than Easter, as that of the meeting of St. Patrick and the King. The Samhain feast received a Christian baptism as the feast of the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary. The festival, known as the Lucid Lam Fada, or Festival of Love, had no connection with the fires. It was held from the 1st to the 16th of August in honour of the sun and moon, when games, more or less accompanied by greetings of the two sexes, were duly celebrated. That was interesting. That was a nice, interesting chapter there. And I'm not saying there was nothing there there was nothing new there, I don't think, but it's just nice to refresh everything. Anyway, I'll have a look at StreamYard, see if anyone's in yet. How you doing, No Mask? Good to see you, mate. Aye, that's the whole point. Is it's not really to be. You can obviously chat away in the chat, but the whole purpose of these streams is to read and use guys to listen and maybe chip in if you can be bothered. But I'm guessing most of these are probably lying in your bed or just chilling out. So me reading this stuff, I didn't expect you guys to be hammering away in the chat. That's not the purpose of these readings. The purpose of these readings is for you just to relax and listen to some old literature. Right. Beltane. Here we go, guys. Baal, or Bel, is associated with the fires. Beltane was a lucky fire through which the cattle were passed for purification. Spencer declared that in this day the Irish never put out a fire without a prayer. The Gaba Bail, or trial by Baal, subjected the person with bare feet to pass 3 times through a fire. A festival is mentioned when birds and other creatures previously caught were set free with lights attached to them. There was an old Irish prayer, Bealain corrupted to Bledain. Then we have Beltinny, or Baal's Fire, the cromlech near Cork, or Belach Magdadair, Ake Beltine, or Beltinny, the night of Baal's Fire, Baltinglass, Bel Ain, Circle of Baal, etc. Mrs. Anna Wilkes in Ireland, the Ur of the Chaldees, sees in the Irish and Hebrew word Ur, the sacred fire. I've read this book, guys, Anna Wilkes's Ireland, the Ur of Chaldees. I'm sure it's, if you go through my channel, you'll find it in the reading. I think even on the website, jedskeptomedia.com, if you look in the book readings, you'll probably find that one. I think I did post that one on the website. But interesting book. Again, it's obviously an old book because this is an old book. Right, so Mrs. Anna Wilkes in Ireland, Ur of the Chaldees, sees in the Irish and Hebrew word Ur, the sacred fire. A fire priest was Ur-Bad, or Higher-Bad, the perpetual fire in the monastery of Seager, says the tripartite life was at the place where St. Patrick first met St. Kieran. The Rinseed Fada was a sacred dance of the Irish at Beltane, like dances recorded of Phoenicia and Assyria. At Uisneach, the navel of Ireland, where the Druids lighted the first fires of the season, courts were regularly held till long after the Christian times. The Venerable Bede records that even in his lifetime, many of the Irish were given to fire worship. Fraser assures his readers that in the south of Ireland, the wayside beggar, whose appeals for charity have met with a liberal response, you can think of no benediction so comprehensive as, "May the blessings of Bel rest upon you." Chaldees, the recognised successors of the Druids in Ireland and Scotland, are said to owe their name, Cal, Gal, or Kale, to the word meaning preserver of fire. It is still lucky, writes one, for the young people to jump over the flames or for cattle to pass between 2 fires. Another says, our forefathers sent their sons and daughters through the fires to Moloch. In Toland's day, firebrands were cast about the fields of corn at Midsummer's Eve, the survival of prayers of the fire god to give heat for the harvest perfection. He calls the November fire Tyne Tlacht Ga, or fire ground, and yet Arthur Clive considered fire worship opposed alike to Druidism and the faith preceding it. In the Book of Rites, so ably reproduced by J. O'Donovan, there are 4 seasons described: Iraq, Sarah, Fogmar, and Gimri, which he finds to be undoubtedly Irish words not derived from the Latin through Christianity. Fires were lighted at Beltane in the beginning of Samra. The summer fires, Samhain, were known as the name of Tlacca. The new fire was produced by the wheel and spindle with toe. The wheel, a solar symbol, must be turned by the spokes in the direction of the sun's daily course. As Scotland, especially the western part, was largely peopled from Ireland, it would not be surprising to recognise Baal, or fire worship, there. All Hallow Eve ceremonies are well known, and especially the passing through the fire, although the Council of Constantinople, 680, expressly prohibited the heathen practice of leaping through fire. The Reverend Alan Stewart, referring to such fires in his parish of Kirkmichael, famous for its druidical circle, said the practice of lighting bonfires prevails in this and the neighbouring Highland parishes. These were the Tinnigan or Need fires. Regular balfires continued in Ayrshire till 1780, and milkmaids still like to drive their cows through the flames with a rowan stick. The proper way to light the fire is by friction. S. Lang writes of the balfires which, when I was young, were lighted on midsummer night on the hills of Orkney and Shetland. As a boy, I have rushed with my playmates through the smoke of these bonfires, without a suspicion that they were repeating the homage paid to Baal in the valley of Hinnom. One cannot help remembering the passage in Isaiah 1, 2. All ye that kindle a fire, that compass yourselves about with sparks, walk in the light of your fire, and in the sparks that ye have kindled. Virgil records a prayer to Apollo at Soracte, whom first we serve, whole woods of unctuous pine, born on thy heap, and to thy glory shine, by thee protected with our naked souls, through flame unsinged we pass and tread the kindled coals. The poet did not add that such devotees first applied a special ointment to their feet. The Scotch Beltane, till lately, was observed in the Hebrides with something more heathen than the fire. The people lighted the fire by the old-fashioned of friction with 2 pieces of wood, and then ate the consecrated cake indulged in by pagan Syrians. The Scotch had the mixture of eggs, milk, and oatcake. This was broken up and distributed among the assembly. Whoever got the black bit hidden in the cake was considered worthy of sacrifice to Baal as the Celtic Beltane. He was pushed into the fire, though soon rescued, and afterwards had to leap 3 times through the flames. The term Beltane, Carline, was ever a name of reproach. In other places, at the Beltane, a trench was cut round the fire. The young men assembled in the circle and cast lots who should be the threefold leaper. Before eating the consecrated oatcake, a libation in heathen style was poured upon the ground. The Scotch generally are not known so given to sacramentarianism. See that? I'm on the ball tonight there. Sacramentarianism. Dr. Donald Clark conceives that the Beltane is not derived from Baal. The Isle of Man, coming more under the influence of Ireland than any neighbouring land, has survivals of the old worship. Waldron asserts, not a family in the old island of natives but keeps a fire constantly burning, or the most terrible devastations and mischief would immediately ensue. Train, in his account of the people, writes, almost down to the present time, no native of the Isle of Man will lend anything on either of the great druidical festivals. The Dizuel dance, and anciently in honour of the sun, is still practised there, going like the sun from east to south in its course, not ear to eel, or going round by east to north. Fires were kept up on the 1st of November as at Halloween. Plowden, another historian of the place, remarks that the Scotch, Irish and Manx call the first day of May Beltane, or the day of Baal's fire. A newspaper of 1837 has this paragraph. On May Day, the people of the Isle of Man have, from time immemorial, burned all wind bushes in the island, conceiving that they thereby burn all the witches and fairies which they believe take refuge there. In like manner, in the Isle of Lewis, they had the custom of decil, right hand, or des, from carrying fire in the right hand about houses and the stock. When a murrain occurred among the cattle there, all fires were formally put out, and a fresh flame obtained by the rubbing of 2 planks together. So we've done some research on Isle of Lewis, guys, about the Shoney and that church in St. Molag. This was all happening on the Isles of Lewis as well. The Gaelic councils tried in vain to arrest this fire devotion. James I of Scotland has left a poem on the custom. At Beltane, Quihin ilk bodies browness, to Peebles to the play. That is, all Beltane all went to play or games at Peebles. And I've been doing Peebles a few times, guys. I've done a stream a couple of times doing there as well. In Cornwall, another part of the Irish influence, Midsummer Eve was kept up with fire rejoicings. At Penzance, I've been there as well. I'd actually done an open top tour with my son when it was raining in the Penzance. Until a few years ago, on that eve, men carried 2 barrels on poles. Others had torches and rockets, and girls held flowers. All at once all joined hands and ran through the streets crying out, "An eye, an eye!" When an eye was opened by a pair, and all passed through, the old county dance was one in the same style. No one needs reminding how far Wales, long under Irish rule, had similar fire customs. At Newton, Nottage, till very recently, people leaped through the midsummer fires. Of this custom, Theodoret, in his condemnation of it, admitted that it was held as an expiation of sin, or expiation of sin. Great fires were kept up formerly on the Noonside Rock of Burham, a Yorkshire Druidical locality. Brimham. France, especially in Brittany, has survivals of fire worship. Such fires were useful to bless the apple trees and forward the harvest. A Breton priest was once called Bellic, which means a servant of Baal. Outside Paris, balfires were lighted on St. John's Eve. Flammarion in 1867 wrote, In the evening, the bonfires in honour of the feast of St. John were lighted all around Angoulême, and men and women were dancing before them and jumping over them almost all night. Russia and India have their leaping through the flames. In the first, a straw figure of Kupalo, a sort of representative of vegetation, was thrown in the fire. Germans had a straw image of the god Thor. In Mexico, babes on their 4th day were passed through the fire. Sonorat had this account of Dharma, a feast of fire in India. It lasts 18 days, during which time those who make a vow to keep it must fast, abstain from women, lie on the bare ground, and walk on a brisk fire. On the 18th day, they assemble in the sound of instruments, their heads covered with flowers, the body daubed with saffron, and follow in cadence with figures of Dharma Raja and Dobredi, his wife, who are carried there in the procession. When they come to the fire, they stir it to animate its activity and take a little of the ashes, with which they rub their foreheads. And when the gods have been 3 times round it, they walk either fast or slow, according to their zeal, over a very hot fire, extended to about 40 feet in length. Fire worship may be the purest form of idolatry, as flame, so nearly immaterial, ever moving, always aspiring, is a type of the spiritual, is useful, although dangerous. But no form of idolatry could be more cruel than the fiery adoration of the grim Moloch. Symbols are agreeable to fancy and often helpful, but they may, and repeatedly do, lead men to crass idolatry. Interesting there, a lot of Baal talk, a lot of Moloch talk, a lot of fire talk. So how you doing, guys? No Mask Epics in the house now. And Jamie, how you doing, Jamie? Just watched your last video there about the, what were they called, the traps or something like that, decapitate the, oh, God knows what that was. I didn't really pay attention to these articles you read, Jamie. Like, I noticed the articles that you read are like the Telegraph and the Daily Mail and things like that. Actually, I avoid those articles, like in general. I avoid most news. But it's a shame that even though I try my best to avoid all the crap in the TV and the news, guys that I'm sub to, like yourself, are still repeating the rubbish. Can still passing it around, still making it relevant. It's just a shame, Jamie, you can't see really what you're doing. But anyway, good to see you. And we'll get back to the reading. Stone worship. This is me, man. This is I'm a stone worshipper. Nah, I'm not really, but I do like my stone. In many lands, shapeless stones have been adored. Among several ancient nations, the idea of divinity was symbolized by a rough stone. That aerolites should be reversed is not surprising, since they, as the idol stone of Ephesus, came down from heaven. A single pillar stone might well, in rude times, typify generative force. Jupiter, Apollo, Venus, Mercury, and Diana Patroa were adored as stone columns. A circle of upright stones has been reverenced from the Pacific across the Old World to the Atlantic. Ireland was no exception to this lithic faith. It has been customary to call circles, cromlechs, loganstones, pillar stones, or serpentine and alignment stones by the appellation of druidical. As these, however, are found in Japan, China, India, Persia, Arabia, Palestine, Barbary, every country of Europe, North and South America, as well as in the Pacific Isles, it would imply certainly a very wide range of Druids. No one could deny that in some parts, as Brittany and the British Isles, so-called Druids probably used such stones as being already objects of reverence, without crediting them either as their builders or as the originators of stone worship. Because of the superstition attached to such megalithic objects, Mahometan and Christian priests have alike sought their destruction, but Ireland and the islands adjacent exhibit many remains of so-called druidical monuments. Some of these may be mentioned. Single stones. This is what I'm talking about, guys. Sometimes you have a couple of paragraphs for a chapter, and sometimes you could be reading a really long chapter. Anyway, single stones. Finn's fingerstone, Clonduff of Down, thrown by Finn McCool. Deerstone of Glendalough, Curtalton of Kildare, Clowgrain or Sunstone, Kalina of Antrim, Ardfert of Kerry, and several on Innismurray. Some old crosses have been rudely carved out of Bethels. So the reason why this is a short chapter, because I just mentioned certain stones. So this will be certain stone circles. Circles have suffered more destruction in Ireland than in Great Britain. One at Ballinahatna, near Dundalk, has quite a Stonehenge character. In 1810, the Rostrevor Circle was 120 foot in diameter. That at Mount Druid, Dalkey, was 150 feet. Kilballyowen of Limerick has 3 circles. Carrowmore of Sligo is half a mile across, and one near Belfast must have been once nearly as large. Breffin of Cavan was a celebrated 2 centuries back. Then there are circles at Dooman of Neath, Templebryan of Cork, Balrickin of Louth, Innisune of Donegal, Rathhu, Carracadira of Waterford, and several in Louth. Cobale was a stone enclosure, as were the Duns and Cassiols, that were often converted into oratories. Ossian repeatedly mentions the circle of Loda. So now we have Logan stones. Logan stones are the rocking ones and were held as divining stones. At Magee, south of Antrim, the weight of one is 12 tons. This is thought to be Ossian's rocking stone of Cromla. His stone of power heard his hero's voice. In the pass of Dunlow, Kerry's one 24 feet round. That of Carrig a Chopian is near Macroon, and Sligo has one at Ballina. Dolmens or cromlechs is known in Ireland generally as the burying place of a giant or hero, if not the bed of a saint. Whether earth-fast or not, it had a leaning or capstone resting on 2 or more upright stones, which sometimes formed a sort of passage. The house of flagstones were known as the Fos Leek. As Liba na Bifian, it was the grave of heroes. As Liba na Fearmore was the grave of giants. An enormous one exists at Calry, Sligo County. One bed at Mayo is 15 feet long. Another is called Edward and Gracie's bed. A third is named after the hero Dermid, who ran off with fair grain. A Lebar Dermid remains near Cleggan Bay, Galway. A Granny's Bed is at Glanworth of Cork. A Warrior's Rest lies at Hyde, Cork County. The capstones of some were large as 24 feet in length. One near Mount Brown weighed 110 tons. There are cromlechs at Finvoy of Antrim, Dundonald of Down, Ballymascandlan of Dundalk, Rathkenny of Meath, Mount Venus of Dublin County, Castle Derg of Tyrone, Fairymount, and others of Louth, Kinvile of Galway, Liba na Fane or Kissenstone of Sligo, Lowry of Tyrone, Slaygrain of Kilkenny, Kilternan of County Dublin, Castlehyde of Cork County, Ballantoy of Antrim, Slabecrobe of Drumgoolan of Down, Gary Duff of Kilkenny, Sugarloaf of Waterford, Burren and others of Clare, with those of Inishark, Killina, Fintona, Mullamast, Kilternail, Lennon, Knockeen, Dunmore, Lowger Isle, Headfort, Ballylaura, Gallstown, Ballynagira, Killala, Castlewellan, Mount Vernes, Brown, Rathkelly, Moytara, Carlow, Carrignacroith, at Drumgoolan, etc. While the Cromrick of Howth, Dublin Bay, said to be the tomb of Oscar, son of Ossian, is a more romantic object, that of Newgrange by Drogheda is a more wonderful. Formerly covered with earth, its interior was first made known in 1699. Standing on 2 acres of land, it rises 67 feet. At the base, the diameter is 319 feet. At the top, 118 feet. There is a gallery of stones 62 feet in length with a number of chambers, one of which is 20 feet in height. Inscribed stones are not so common as in Wales and Scotland, but the symbols of discs, double discs, circles, concentric circles, bow and sceptre, volutes, wheels, spirals, zigzags, all am writing, pentagons, triangles, spectacle ornaments, spectres, serpents, horseshoes, mirrors and combs, fishes, boars, elephants, horses, bulls, camels, crosses, grooves, cups, etc., are not unknown in Erin. There are figures with kilts and others with crowns. Some slabs at Lough Crew are seen covered with various inscriptions. Newgrange has a number of them, like as in Scotland, France, India, the north of England, etc. What meaning has been given to these monuments? In the scientific age, circles, etc., are simply called the external adjuncts of Bronze Age burials. In the East, they have been treated as bactiles or bethels, to be duly anointed with oil or milk and adored. They are sometimes smeared over with blood of sacrifices. The Cabor doctrine came conveniently for others in explanation. The Cabirs were assuredly worshipped in caves. Some Welsh writers early claimed this theory accounts for their Druids. These latter were said to be of Cabaric association, as Samothrace or Samothrace was the headquarters of the Cabiri, which may have been of Phoenician origin, and as of the Phoenicians visited the British Isles, it was concluded that Druidism was the same religion, especially as associated with fire and stones. Anyhow, the stones were a puzzle. John Aubrey, just 2 centuries ago, introduced the Druidical theory, which was at once seized upon by the Welsh, Scotch, English, and Irish scholars as an easy solution. Still, as Professor P. Smith reminds us well, they were about as mysterious to the Greeks and Romans as to ourselves. And de Courson asks, but were these grand sanctuaries of stone specially affected to the Druidic worship? Temples, altars, perfectly similar, exist in fact in all parts of the earth. If they are Druidical, says Picard, the Romans would not have omitted to explain to us the nature of the place appointed for worship, for the Druids were their contemporaries. On the other hand, Maurian, the modern Druid, declares these temples were their holy of holies. Mauryan's master, the late Archdruid Miffer, speaking of the greatest of British temples, remarked, "Its antiquity is so great as to reach behind the age of the circular temples themselves, inasmuch as it was in order to correspond with the different bardic points that the stones were so arranged in those ancient temples." Excuse me, guys, just wetting the palate. Madame Blavatsky, for the fifth time, gave the Theosophists' notion in these terms: the Druidical circles, the dolmens, the temples of India, Egypt, and Greece, the towers, and the 177 towns of Europe, which were found Cyclopean in origin by the French Institute, are all the work of initiated priest architects, the descendants of those primary taught by the sons of God, justly called the builders. Naturally, she sought a source anterior to the age of Druids. She ascended to the ancient Aryan masters in Tibet. But Colonel Forbes Leslie advances further, saying, "It will not be disputed that the primitive Cyclopean monuments of the Deccan were created prior to the arrival of the present dominant race, the Hindus. Professor Benfey, too, called them pre-Aryan, therefore over 4,000 years in age, at least." A letter of 1692, subsequently sent to the Society of Antiquaries, had these words: "Albeit from the general tradition that these monuments were places of pagan worship, and from the historical knowledge we have that the superstition of the Druids did take place in Britain, but we may rationally conclude that these monuments have been temples of the Druids, yet I have found nothing hitherto, either in the names of these monuments or the tradition that goes about them, which doth particularly relate to the Druids or points them out." In other words, these stone circles, it doesn't mean they were Druidical, and it doesn't mean they built them. In fact, they could have been ancient when the Druids were kicking around. These could have been ancient monuments built by a forgotten race of people. This led Dr. Joseph Anderson in his Scotland in Pagan Times to observe, "It is clear from the Lucis statement that, in the end of the 17th century, there was no tradition among the people connecting these monuments with Druids. They were simply regarded as places of pagan worship. Most persons may agree with Rivet Karnak. It seems hardly improbable that the ruins in Europe are the remains of that primitive form of worship, which is known to have extended at one time over a great portion of the globe. Not a few have detected in these monuments remnants of the old phallic worship, some illustrating the male principle and others symbolizing the female. Dudley's symbolism detects the worship of the former in the circle and the female in the quadrangular. Others would see the feminine in the circular and the masculine in the standing stone. Astronomy, some think, furnishes a solution. The circle of 12 stones, or any multiple of 12, might represent the constellations, as 19 would suit a lunar period. Dr. Keneally, a proficient in mystic studies, wrote, "The Druidical temples called Anna Mor were composed of 48 stones, denoting the numbers of the old constellations, with a Kabbalah of 9 stones near the circumference on the inside to represent the sun in its progress through the signs. We may accept the dictum of Dr. Clarke that the stone circles were the temples of the British Isles, that down to the Reformation the general name in Gaelic for a church was Team Pool, and is still implied to the old Chaldee churches of the Outer Hebrides." And we've seen that when we were looking at that. It was called Team Paul Molag. It was the church, Molag, St. Molag's church. It's still applied to the old Chaldee churches of the Outer Hebrides. Furlong says, "In such monuments as you see the very earliest idea of the temple. The columns took the place of tree stems and later on became circular or solar forms." St. Martin of Tours mentioned a turreted fabric of highly polished stones, out of which rose a lofty cone. This had relation to phallic superstition. The worship of stones was expressly forbidden by the Council of Nantes in the 7th century, and as late as 1672 by an ecclesiastical ordinance ordering the destruction of circles. Welshmen were shown the impotence of these objects by the power of St. David splitting the capstone of Main Ketty in Gower. The Irish, like their neighbours, venerated their lithic temples. They not only anointed them, as may be still done to the sacred cone in India, but down to a late period they poured water on their sacred surface that the drought might cure their diseases. Molly Grime, a rude stone figure kept in Glentham Church, was annually washed with water from Newell Well. So was a wooden image of St. Fumac, washed in water from a holy well near Keith. Babies were sprinkled at cairns in western or south Scotland down to the 17th century. Some stones were kissed by the faithful, like the Druids stone in front of the Chartres Cathedral, once carefully kept in the crypt. The Cloch Lobre of Waterford has a great reputation for deciding difficult cases, but this virtue was lost under circumstances thus narrated. But the good stone, which appears to have been a remnant of the Golden Age, was finally so horrified at the ingenuity of a wicked woman in defending her character that it trembled with horror and split in twain. It seems to have been a sensible and sensitive as were those pillar stones near Cork, which is devoutly attested being carried off to serve some vulgar building purposes, took the opportunity of nightly shades to retreat to their old quarters. At last, in vexation, the builders shot them into the water. After waiting the departure of their sacrilegious captors, they mysteriously glided back to their former standing place. These were not the holy stones endowed with a sense and motion. At the command of a saint, they have safely borne over bays and streams, one standing upon them. The stone at the grave of St. Declan was seen to float over the sea with his bell, his vestments, and his candle. St. Senan, sitting on a stone, was carefully lifted with it by angels to the top of a hill. St. Patrick is connected with the cromlech of Fintona, the so-called giant's grave, to rebuke one skeptical as to the resurrection. He is said to have struck the grave with the staff of Jesus when the giant rose from the dead, thankful for a temporary respite from the pains of hell. After learning he had been swineherd to King Logair, the saint recommended him to be baptized. To this rite he submitted. He then lay down to his grave in peace, secure against further torment. So there is a lot of connections with stones, and same with Jacob, the stone of destiny. This Jacob, you're probably going to hear about it coming up. But Jacob laid his head on this stone, and this stone apparently was used to anoint every king of Scotland and Ireland up to pretty late periods. Stories of giants were common of old. Jocelyn speaks of Fionn mac Con as one of them, and Ossian's heroes were often gigantic. Boetius records Fionn as being 15 cubits high, but St. Patrick's giant was represented by one bard as 120 feet in length. The 12 stones of Usnech were said to have been cursed by the saint so that they could not be built into any structure. In the cromlech on the Walsh Hills, Finn mac Coyle was said to have kept his celebrated hounds. A cromlech was a Bethel, or a house of God. St. Declan's Stone, Waterford, had a hole through which people crawled for the cure of maladies. The pillar stone of Firbrege had the gift of prophecy and was duly consulted by those who had lost their cattle. One pillar stone, much frequented in pagan times, split with a great crash after a discourse on the better faith, when out leaped a cat, doubtless a black one. The rock of Cashel, for ages a consecrated place, was known as St. Patrick's Stone. Cashel is said to have been the place where angels were waiting for the saint's arrival in Erin. The tooth of the saint was a venerated piece of sandstone, which somewhat resembled a tooth in shape, possibly much of Guantama's footstep on Adam's Peak in Ceylon. St. Columba, likewise, among the Hebrides, had a reputation for stones. There is his red stone, his blue eggstone in Skye, his blue stone of Glen Culumkillow, his stony beds of penitence, his lingam stones, which worked miracles. He was born on a stone. He was sustained in famine by sucking meal from the holy stone of Mol Blatha. Right, guys, how long's that? That must have been about an hour, eh? I'm trying to keep these sort of like hour longs. How you doing, D? Nice to see you, mate. So there's my buddy D, Eternal Badawan. Good to see you, man. I'm just doing little reading sessions. I'm going to just take a break right now. Keep it an hour long and start a new one in about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Do you know what? I'll set it up for 20 past midnight. Right, guys. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next reading session. We'll try and get this finished tonight, eh? Try and maybe make this next one the last one. Right, guys. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you in 20 minutes. Cheers.